I guess we'll get started. They'll come wandering in. We're in the middle of several different press conferences and all, but we'll be sure that they get the information that y'all provide. I'm Dina Titus. I want to welcome you to our subcommittee. We want to talk this morning about the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. I guess it's typically known as DRRA. You are the major stakeholders. You've been dealing with this act. You know more about it from firsthand experience and on the ground than we do, and we want to hear from you. We invited FEMA, I want you to know that, to participate in the roundtable. They declined, but they sent some members of their intergovernmental affairs team here so they can hear what we say, and we will definitely be following up with them. Could you identify yourselves in the audience? Oh, yeah, thank you. All right, thank you very much. We believe that this act has been transformative. It's come out of disaster. That's usually the way it works. We are reactive as opposed to proactive, but these are some of the most striking changes probably since Katrina, first major set of amendments to the Stafford Act in half a decade since Sandy. So we want to be sure that we're doing it right. I think the roundtable this morning is going to be informal, but we want to answer 3 questions. What's FEMA getting right in the implementation of DRRA? What's FEMA getting wrong? And what do you and your organization think would be some ways to more effectively change the course and correct some of the problems? We will have other members here to ask questions, but I think maybe we'll just start, if you'll go down the row and introduce yourselves, the organization you're with, and just kind of tell us what maybe the highlights of what you want to see changed or what your wish list is, or maybe the number 1 or 2 things that you're concerned about. You don't have to give us a whole big formal testimony, and we'll open it up to questions and just conversation if that is okay with you. All right. Well, we'll start with you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being back before this committee after a sojourn in a different direction. We're glad to see you.
Madam Chair, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And first of all, on behalf of the Build Strong organization, I want to thank you, particularly your committee, for the work you put in on this. This is, I think this is one of the most transformational pieces of legislation as far as emergency management is concerned that we've had, like you said, since the post-Katrina Emergency Reform Act came out. So I appreciate very much your diligence. I appreciate you holding this roundtable. It's going to mean, I think, mean a lot to us. I'd also appreciate the format you set up, so I don't have to read all this stuff. You asked what FEMA got right. What I think they got, not I know they got right, is when they were putting the DRRA together, they brought in a lot of stakeholders, took a lot of information, and gathered all that together and starting to put things out the door. I wouldn't say, from my opinion, they've gotten things wrong, but I travel a lot. I meet a lot of emergency managers. I meet a lot of fire people, and most of them don't even know this exists. So I think they need to do a much better job of publicizing what this is about. This is very, very significant in what's happening. I can tell you firsthand, I was a fire chief in Miami-Dade County when Hurricane Andrew came through. We lost 90,000 homes that should not have come apart. I mean, they came apart. So we changed our building codes. We had to fight tooth and nail, but we got our building codes changed. And since I've been in my house the last 20 years, I've had 2 hurricanes right across the top of my house, literally no damage at all because of the building codes we put in place. So this piece of legislation, if we do it correctly, and we better do it correctly, we only get one shot at it, will be such a significant impact on our resiliency in this country, because the money is going to be there to do the things we've wanted to do but have not had the funding to do. So I think that if I was going to ask FEMA to do one thing, continue working very hard, which they are. It's a heavy lift, but I think they need to do a better job of getting the word out, telling people exactly what this is about. A press release doesn't do it. They need to be out there on the street, talking to emergency managers, talking to fire people, talking to mayors, talking to governors, and tell them how important this piece of legislation is and what it's going to do for them.
Thank you. I would have to echo everything Mr. Paulison has said. He's hit most of the items very, very straightforward. And I think from our organization, the National Emergency Managers Association, is that, we are the contact to the local jurisdictions through each state emergency management agency to the local jurisdictions. We know that all events are responded to and they recover from locally. And we're also going to be in the position of providing that resiliency through mitigation at the local level. FEMA is not in a position to be able to talk to every local jurisdiction. The states are. And the need to open up and work a little bit closer with us, maybe drop some of the bureaucracy so that we can sit and discuss openly what it is we really can do to push this forward. It's a tremendous opportunity, and I know in our state alone and talking with some of the other state directors, they're out discussing it with their local jurisdictions. Really, we've never had this opportunity for this amount of money to be made available to states and locals since the beginning of the Homeland Security Program. So this is that type of opportunity, and we want to seize it. We want to do it right. We want to work with Congress. We want to work with FEMA. We also want to work with the other 17 federal agencies that also have operations and recovery efforts and mitigation efforts in disasters. So we're here to basically embrace everyone and become a partner at the table. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dan Robeson, and I'm the Emergency Management Coordinator for Johnson County, Kansas. I've been working in emergency management for 20 years and been a certified emergency manager for 14. I'm here today as a representative from the USA Council of the International Association of Emergency Managers. What I think is most important about DRRA is the same thing that was important about Syria and Pekimra and the Stafford Act, is that we continue to improve. We continue to look at what we've done in past disasters, identify what we need to do about risk, and work together to address it. In my community, we continually refer to the first sentence of our disaster plan for people's awareness, and that states that Johnson County is vulnerable to disasters. And those 6 words are the genesis of everything we do. And it's because we are at risk, and what we do about that risk matters. And what's so uniquely important about DRRA is that it addresses a very specific element about risk, and that is that it costs, and that there are costs associated, and we have to deal with that and cope with those costs in one way or another. And the question has always been, how do we want to do that? How do we want to deal with these costs? And DRRA is signaling what the answer to that question is, which is what we know now is that while it's hard to do, spending money and time and effort before a disaster to mitigate hazards saves lives and property, and it helps keep our communities intact, and it saves money as well. And so we're excited to continue working with FEMA and other partners in terms of what's going well and areas for improvement. While some of the additional work is important work is still out there to take care of, we know that there have been implementations, significant ones, that have occurred in the last year. And moving forward, while there's room for improvement in communication, there has been communication and stakeholder engagement. So we look forward to continuing to work with our partners on this and are interested in making sure that there's continued oversight to ensure that the implementation occurs as it should. Exactly.
Dr. Wesley Bissett with the Texas A&M Veterinary Emergency Team, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about the animal side of things. Certainly, you know, when we think about the people that are here on this panel and priorities, we understand that animals are never the highest priority. They can't be. It's human life and human welfare, but animals are important. And in all honesty, you can't take care of your highest priority if you're not taking care of the animal piece as well. It's the role they play in our lives. You know, a lot of positive has happened since Katrina and Rita on the animal side, but we have a long way to go. And I think certainly, you know, FEMA has made a tremendous amount of progress over the years. I know I personally have had the opportunity as the director of the State Veterinary Medical Resource, and our ability to interact with FEMA and interact with the USAR network has all been very positive. But I think that there are things that can be done better. And the thing that I think specifically I'd like to visit about is basically there was authorization to create federal veterinary medical response teams at colleges of veterinary medicine. That has not been funded to this point, and I think it leaves a tremendous vacuum. The reality is that whenever you look at many local and even state governments, they really don't have the capacity to deal with the animal piece. And so a strong federal presence, I think, is important, and I would argue that the current model that's used hasn't been particularly effective. And so I think FEMA has an opportunity to really make a difference here. And by doing so at a College of Veterinary Medicine, they have the ability not only to impact that community that's been devastated by disaster, but to impact young professionals that are going to go out around their states and around the country and really build local capacity. So I think that if they will address development of those teams at colleges of veterinary medicine, it's very much a positive pathway forward. Most definitely, people will make those decisions that ultimately at times will cost them their lives. Another piece of that is that whenever you don't have that strong capability there to meet that animal need, it creates a vacuum. And the vacuum is filled with the self-deployed, and we've seen where what that leads to is movement of animals away from impact areas. The one thing that I've learned across, we're up at 19 deployments now, the one thing that I've learned, the most important lesson, is the role those animals play in the recovery of the people. I've seen those reunions, I've been part of those reunions, and in all honesty, I tell our team members we're in the business of hope, because whenever you put that unit back together, they're taking a step forward. And I've heard so many times, Doc, everything's going to be okay. And I've listened to their stories, so it matters.
Hello, thank you again for inviting me. I am Lindsay Holman. I'm with the National Association of Counties. I serve as their Associate Legislative Director for Justice and Public Safety. Something that I think we've been hearing from our counties across the country is the need to make sure that we leverage these provisions in time to address ongoing disasters. Right now, we're dealing with one of the largest cumulative disaster recovery efforts I think our country has ever seen, and it would be a shame for the opportunities that are present now, especially before rebuilding begins, to not leverage those towards building back more resilience and actually maximizing that investment that the federal government is making, the state government is making, to make our communities more holistically resilient to natural disasters. One thing that we would really like to see is more implementation at the ground level where disaster recovery is actually happening. There's many provisions in DRRA that could be leveraged to maximize hazard mitigation measures, not only through HMGP, but also through the Public Assistance Program. And I think it would be very interesting to see the regions actually demonstrate how they are implementing this and rolling it out to the local level. As we heard earlier, there's a lot of local emergency management and first responders that aren't actually aware of many of these provisions that have already been rolled out. So I would just say, take consideration to just because it's on paper doesn't mean it's happening. And I think we would love to see the regions actually demonstrate the outputs and the results from ongoing and current disaster recovery and preparedness efforts on this. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jeff Fide with State Farm Insurance, and I'm here today representing the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. State Farm's a NAMIC member, and NAMIC is the nation's oldest property casualty insurance trade association, whose membership includes 1,400 companies. State Farm is also an executive committee member of the Build Strong Coalition, in which NAMIC is a founding member. As we see on a daily basis around the nation, now is more important than ever to ensure we are doing all we can from a federal perspective to save lives by hardening homes and communities before disasters, and we commend the leadership of this subcommittee for holding today's important discussion. Like the others have already commented, we want to be, through NAMIC and Build Strong Coalition, a partner with FEMA and see them succeed with the implementation of the DRRA. We also realize that there is a general lack of knowledge of what DRRA can do, and the communication for that and awareness campaign should be put forth by FEMA as efficiently as possible. One main concern that we have is NAMIC urging FEMA to implement DRRA cost share incentive component. The enactment of DRRA followed the huge milestone signing into law the first ever federal incentive for states to adopt and enforce stronger residential building codes. That was an incentive. The provision was originally in the DRRA but pulled out and signed into law February 2018, would allow states to receive 10% more federal money after disasters for increasing resiliency. This has been the major sail that Build Strong Coalition had erected when they started, is getting the incentive for states to adopt statewide building codes and have them enforced effectively. We're concerned about the delay in implementing that, and then the priorities that FEMA might have that might not be along the intent of what Congress expected of adopting up-to-date model building codes as a priority. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairwoman Titus and Ranking Member Meadows. I'm pleased to appear before you today on behalf of the 140,000 members of the National Association of Home Builders to share our views on DRRA, especially as it relates to affordability, code adoption, and code development. Our specific issue is related to the term "the latest published codes." We feel that there's some misinterpretation that could be with a direct definition of latest published codes. Our concern is that states will be encouraged to actually adopt them immediately rather than their current cycles that they're on. There's a 3-year cycle, 6-year cycles that many of the states are on, and then they won't have the ability to amend. These are critical items for the states. And subsequent codes have matured greatly from the 1990s and the 2000s, most notably in reaction to Andrew Hurricane and the Northridge earthquake in 1994. Over the past few code cycles, the changes have been less dramatic. We would like to classify these additions of the codes as modern and should be considered resilient as they are already. Reducing the urgency to adopt the latest published codes rather than the 2 latest published codes we think are much more practical. For example, if there is a disaster that would occur right now with a state that's on the 2015 code, there might not be funding available to them because the 2018 would be interpreted as the latest published code. And the last thing that some of these states want to be doing in the time of a disaster is adopting a latest code while they're on a very recent code. And I think it gets the money out there quicker, so people don't have to learn the new codes. They don't have to the training and figure out what these new codes are when their number one issue is really trying to recover from a disaster. And then there's also issues with amending the codes at the state level, which are critical. You know, the code development process, which I'll refer to as the I codes, because generally they're adopted basically as the primary building code in every state in the United States, is produced on a 3-year basis, but it's developed as a model code. And when it goes through the adoption process, we have these nationally developed codes have issues, have they're, I'm sorry, they're developed nationally, but there's some specific issues at the state and local level that maybe aren't considered during the code development process that are important at the adoption process. So states should always be able to make these local amendments that are critical to them, that are important for their specific needs. Right now, there are 11 states that don't have code adoption at the state level. They have them at the local level, and there's a variety of ways that states are adopting them. So some are adopting them on a 3-year basis, some are on a 5-year basis, some are on a 6-year basis. So there's a whole variety of adoptions at the state level in different methods that they use. So to us, it's very important that we take those into consideration when you're putting these restrictions of latest published codes. And I think it should be universally understood that it's 2 code cycles, and there should be an ability to adopt or amend at the local level during the adoption process. Well, there's a couple things. So first, that's in section 1235 is, let's make sure I get this right. 1235 doesn't have it defined. It just basically says latest hazard-resistant design or latest published codes. But in 1234, it is with the 2 code cycles and does have the ability to amend, but the 2 code cycles is on a sunset provision for 5 years. So what we'd like to do is have that universally understood that it is 2 code cycles and it applies universally, whether it's pre-disaster or post-disaster.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you for coming. You know, this is such a crucial issue for people in my community, for us in Florida overall. I represent the Florida Keys and Miami-Dade County, and we have so many different parts of moving parts as it pertains to mitigation, resilience, funding. And I have to say, you touched my heart with that story about animals, because we have a lot of seniors who live in my district who have animals, and it's exactly what you said. They don't want to leave because they don't have a place to leave their animals. So that just poses a greater risk for my area. But one of the issues that I've been dealing with, which I think it touches most of you in this panel, is the National Flood Insurance Program. And FEMA has been, I think you're postponing the mapping system. And if you can talk a little bit about that and how that affects the insurance, the National Insurance Agency as you're mapping, if you're following that as well. And also the Home Builders Association affordability is a huge issue for us in South Florida. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, I would really appreciate it.
The flood insurance program that FEMA manages, it needs to be, I'm sorry, Dave Paulison, I'm the former FEMA director. Yeah, and I'm here for Bill Strong, but the flood program needs to be totally revamped. And I think everybody understands that. It's not actuarially sound. Every time we have a big event like a Katrina or a Wilma, or where we have a lot of flooding, they end up borrowing money from the Treasury Department just to pay the bills. There's also I'm glad somebody served from the insurance agency, an issue when flooding is a flood from rising waters or is from a driving storm, and sometimes that's difficult to tell. And there's always maybe a little headbutting between FEMA and the insurance agency of who's responsible for paying for that. So that's an issue we need to deal with right up front. But we have a new FEMA director, just been confirmed by the Senate, and who has an emergency management background, which is very good. And my recommendation is we take that, and I'm just going to fall in your lap probably. How do we put this whole thing together where everyone can have flood insurance that needs it? How do we keep it affordable? And how do we keep it actuarially sound, where we're not continually putting more tax dollars into the system that's really not working that well? So it's very difficult. You know, I don't have the answers. We struggled with it when I was there. So, you know, but I think it's something we really need to take that on. And we need to have the political fortitude to deal with it.
And I would recommend that you also include actual community stakeholders, because I think the problem has been that, you know, FEMA as a federal agency, the bureaucratic process is so disconnected from local communities that there has to be a way that there's a clear communication channel between local municipalities, local communities, and exactly what you're saying. How do we figure out the next mapping system? That's been a frustration in my community, that FEMA has not been responsive and they haven't been a part of the process.
I totally agree. I totally agree. This has to be a united effort. It can't be done in a vacuum. It's got to be done, like you said, with the local communities and states, Congress, working together with FEMA of how do we put a viable program together that works better than it does now.
I would just say from our activity on the mitigation side, we're always supportive of activities that make buildings more flood resistant. Yeah. Yeah. So we're always supportive of efforts that make buildings more flood resistant. So we're looking at building code adoptions, building code improvements, and we stand behind FEMA as they're at the code hearings on the 3-year cycles, advancing mitigation techniques to make buildings more flood resistant. We're behind that and support those types of endeavors to make the buildings more flood resistant.
So mapping is an issue for the home builders, obviously, where you have property where you don't know whether or not it's going to be changed. You know, they're going to change the flood rating of a specific piece of property. So the sooner that and quicker they're able to get them updated, the better off people will be.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I apologize for being late. Had another meeting that I was trying to get free from. I thank you all for your input. I'll be very brief. I'll probably ask more questions as you go along. My big concerns is I can put it in 3 buckets. The first bucket is I'm tired of addressing this over and over again with a bureaucracy that never changes. Okay, so what can we do to really fix it? I think the chairwoman and I agree that this is something that we can come together in a bipartisan manner, but I'm tired of the talk. All right, that's bucket 1. The second part of that is there are certain areas, and you mentioned, Mr. Craig, the maps. There are certain areas that we try to do to try to make this flood insurance profitable. And it's never going to be. Mr. Paulson talked about how do we make it sustainable. We have flood maps in my district that include areas that have never flooded because we're trying to prop it up so that we can pay for flood insurance so that people can live on the coast. I live at 4,200 feet in elevation. If my house floods, all of DC is underwater, and so we've got to come up with a solution that really works. And then the third one is that as we look at this, what I want you to help us understand, where is FEMA, where is HUD, where are the other agencies? Because the big problem, quite frankly, we're talking about FEMA this morning. The big problem is, yes, FEMA in that initial phase, but the bigger problem is HUD and what we do in the mitigation. Some of the NEPA guidelines, I can tell you in North Carolina, we have areas that flood every single time a storm comes through. And so what do? We don't clean out the ditches. We have so many environmental concerns that even in direct responses, they continue to flood. I've flown over them in helicopters where storm after storm after storm, and we somehow think that we can keep putting money in building back and it's not going to flood, and you all know that it will just flood again. So I guess to those 3 buckets, if you can address those, and I just want to sincerely express my appreciation to the chairwoman for her leadership on this. Hopefully this is something that we can get done. And actually keep the jurisdiction here. I know that there was a bill that literally wanted to put everything under HUD. And when they're doing a bad job, to give them more responsibility is not where I think that we should be going. Thanks.
I described very similar buckets before you got here, so we are on the same page. Thank you. Ms. David, did you want?
Thank you. Well, one of the things, I don't actually have a very long opening statement, but I do want to thank Mr. Robeson for being here from Johnson County, Kansas, which is in the district that I represent. And I know that in our area, a lot of times people don't think about the effects of changing weather and climate change when they think about Kansas, but we have a lot of flooding issues and other natural disasters that occur, and it's getting a bit more extreme. So the work that we're doing in our area, some of you have already touched on. One is getting the word out. So I'd be curious to hear from folks a little bit about ways that we can help with that, or that FEMA can help get the word out, because we held a roundtable on emergency management and disaster relief. And we had stakeholders from the faith community, from FEMA, from some of the local law enforcement and that sort of thing. And this is an issue that a lot of folks deal with, is how do we make sure people understand the importance of this? And then second, on the building codes, if you could speak a little bit more about the importance of updating the building codes, but also how we, what we can be doing to help facilitate adoption, and that, I think that if Section 1206, I think, is the appropriate section to get the states and localities to look at enforcement, updating, and that sort of thing. If you could speak a little bit more about what we should be thinking about in getting that implemented. Thank you.
I'd like to comment, I guess, maybe on several of those points, as well as back to Mr. Meadows' point. You know, one of the things from a state perspective we do look to FEMA to be, and I believe and sense that they don't necessarily see that as their role, but they should be the single point of contact for any state, for all of the federal agency, departments and agencies, and what resources and assets and capabilities they have to bring to the table at the time of a disaster. We should not have to shop in any way, shape, or form. They have gotten better with that through the years, but their capability in that could be strengthened, and I don't know, their authority needs to be strengthened so that, I know in my state, when my governor declares a state of emergency, I have the authority to look at a secretary of the transportation and say, you will do this. Well, FEMA should have the same type of capability at the federal level and be able to bring all of those programs together. And I think and then they too need to work on that, in that I think there's confusion with that and their role, not only from FEMA headquarters, but also with the different regions. Some regions may be more receptive to that and other regions aren't, but I think that's something that they could work on internally. The other area, going back to communications again, and how to get the word out, and I almost beg FEMA and beg you to use the state emergency management agencies as the single point of contact in the state, and force us to get that information out, and to get that information out to not only our local jurisdictions, our local governmental organizations, but also our state agencies. But then the piece of this that we kind of don't probably focus on as much as we should, but it's really the private sector and the volunteer organizations. They have an opportunity with this, particularly with the cost-sharing opportunity, to really become involved in their community. And when we have a disaster, and many times I know in Maryland, and we don't have the type of disasters that Florida has experienced or Texas has experienced, but we really depend on the private sector and the volunteer organizations to come in and basically rebuild a community. Because we're not eligible because of size for individual assistance from the federal government, so we have to turn to other avenues for that. So that's an area too. I think that if you would use us and allow us to be at the table and force us to be at the table with FEMA, and to some degree force FEMA to open up, drop a little of the bureaucracy, sit down and have a conversation at a table like this, that we can openly move forward together. We too, as you noted that FEMA declined to attend today, we have invited them to our national meetings and sessions that would be just with the board or specifically with the mitigation and now the resiliency committee. And they've not attended those. They'll come to open sessions, but not necessarily the opportunity to just sit and chat. Now, we are in the process of trying to mend that. We do have a meeting scheduled in January where we're going to make a full attempt on our behalf to really sit and talk with FEMA about some of these things. But that's a big area, is that communication between FEMA and the local jurisdictions.
So, Mr. Strickland, I want to come back to that. So what you're saying is from a National Emergency Managers Association, that FEMA is not willing to work with you on a one-on-one basis to try to address some of these concerns. Is that correct?
We have invited them to sessions, and they have not.
Well, so I want to cut to the chase. I mean, Mike Sprayberry, who is my emergency management, his work in both Republican and Democrat administrations. If Mike tells me to do it, I take that over FEMA or the governor, and I don't care what party the governor is because Mike knows it. So to the extent that you're saying, I'm not talking about just going to a conference and a meeting. I'm talking about a working aspect where you're working with FEMA. You're saying you can't get their willingness to do that with your association. Is that correct?
Yes. I think overall, from the way this has progressed, because this is new to them, they've been very close hold on how they're releasing information to us where we could start back here and talk about it openly before they start releasing.
So what's the here? What's the problem? Because here's what you normally get. You get someone with your ability and responsibility that is blaming the federal government, and the federal government is blaming you. I mean, it happens every storm, no matter where it is, whether it's Maryland or Louisiana or Kansas or anywhere else. It happens because they want to place blame. So is this a blaming thing, why they don't trust you, or what's the issue we're trying to get you guys together to solve?
Some of the direction that we need to go in with this opportunity, particularly with BRIC. We gave to FEMA in August of 2019 our recommendations. They took the recommendations, but we don't have any idea what or of any of these they're incorporating into the policy. We're basically at a point where we're now waiting for the policy to be.
So are you willing to have a special meeting that addresses those concerns?
Absolutely.
All right, so I don't want to speak on behalf of the chairwoman or on behalf of my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, who understands this better than I do, but why don't we put a goal of by the end of January to have that meeting set, and I think we can make the administration feel some pressure if they're not willing to do that. Is that fair?
Thank you.
You okay with that?
Thank you all for being here today. I am from West Virginia, and we obviously have geographical issues because where people place their houses, not everybody can be up high. Most people are down low, and we've had severe flooding many times. From your experience, what do you think is important characteristics for the resilient infrastructure projects that I can take home? Do you have any good suggestions? Any of you? on resiliency.
Well, one thing, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to get into actual specific resilience measures, which I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for, but I would just really, as your counties are working through disaster recovery and as they are formulating those recovery projects into what's called project worksheets, that they make sure that they elevate their voices with the FEMA representatives at the field level, but also their state representatives to make sure that public assistance mitigation measures are incorporated as much as possible. That's why the public assistance mitigation program exists, so that we're not just building back to pre-disaster condition. That actually gives you the opportunity to make some changes to maybe the design of culverts, maybe the size of culverts, drainage culverts that may be completely compacted or filled with debris, elevating some of your local roads and bridges. That can also be something that is worked into, but a lot of times those measures are discussed at the state level with FEMA, and then those decisions are made and kind of passed down to the county level. But a lot of times counties aren't aware of the mitigation measures that they can ask for through public assistance. And I would really like to see more utilization of that specific program where you can just go ahead and get it done.
That's good, because we have had severe damage to several counties. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, let me answer that also. For me, resiliency, we can't necessarily stop disasters from happening. We can do a lot of mitigation to lessen the impact. But how quickly can we get back to some type of normalcy? That's resiliency. Can we keep people in their homes? Can we change our building codes where the homes survive whatever catastrophic event? Is it a hurricane? Is it a tornado? Is it a flood? If we can keep people in their homes, that means they don't have to be in shelters. So that's a burden off of the local government not sheltering people. If we can get grocery stores, banks, and gas stations open, that solves 90% of our problems. And so what can we do to make sure those types of infrastructures are going to survive the catastrophic event and can get open the next day? That to me, that's what resiliency is. How quickly can we bounce back from whatever type of event we had? I was just out in California, and where 2 weeks ago, in some of the areas where the wildfires were, and to watch that community pulling together and bouncing back and trying to get back in their home, get the lots cleared, get the streets cleared. They're really working very hard to get back to something's normal. So that, to me, that's what resiliency is, and that's what this piece of legislation, to me, is going to allow the states and the local communities to do. Can we fortify homes with some of these dollars? Can we raise the bridges? Can we raise the roads? Can we do something to stop flooding? That's why this is so important for us to get it right this time, because we're not going to have a second chance to do that. So I think you can take that back to the bank. And also getting our private sector involved. We've tried in the past, and we haven't done a great job of it. We want to give somebody a contract to do something. Oh, you can't do that. You got to bid it out. Let's get rid of some of the bureaucracy. Let's let the private sector get involved. When I took over FEMA, FEMA was operating with a 1950-style logistics system. I mean, it was terrible. We couldn't track our trucks. We had no idea where they were. We didn't know where supplies were. I brought in people from UPS. I brought in people from FedEx, and I brought in people from Walmart and Home Depot to work in our office to help us resolve that issue. So getting that private sector, and they did it for nothing. They just volunteered the time to come in. But having a formal process in place where we can get the private sector, because they've got the resources. The resources are not at the local level and not at the federal level. They're at the private sector. That's where all the infrastructure is. So that's what we have to do to make this really work.
Do you have any updates or thoughts on building code changes? The majority of our building codes are done like in 2015. And how do we go about updating the building codes?
In my opinion, it's got to be almost a consensus type process. Everyone needs to be involved. When we changed our building codes in Florida, particularly South Florida after Andrew, we made sure we had everybody on board. It wasn't something we could do in a vacuum. The home builders had to be there. We had to have our local elected officials in there. We had fire people involved, emergency managers involved, all of our building code people involved, sitting down together. Why did these homes fail? And what can we do to make sure they didn't fail again? And we changed our building codes, and we did it that way. So, you know, that's why this piece is so important about the building code part of it, of giving states an incentive to have a statewide enforceable building code to make sure that whatever we rebuild is going to be built to the standard that we have in place today.
I'd like to leverage off of that in the memo announcing the meeting today. There's 2 studies in there that reflect the value and the benefit of updated building codes. It shows the 2015 building codes that are in place return to $6 for every dollar invested. And then you move to the 2018 code. The study showed that you returned $11 for every dollar invested in resilient construction, meeting the minimum building codes. We've got a great process in place with the International Code Council and their consensus process of updating codes. It's a public forum, and it's a cycle that occurs every 3 years. Science, technology, research, and testing is fast-paced. That information and data that comes from there needs to get integrated into the building codes. And the best way to get resiliency into the hands of the builder, the building inspectors, and the homeowner is to get it into the minimum building codes. So the importance of getting the codes updated on a regular cycle and in a timely manner is just as critical as you might see the latest iPhone or Android phone. It was good enough 6 months ago, but we already have a new one. How can they make it any better? There are continuing improvements to the building code.
I just wonder about the enforcement, particularly in my area where the homes are older.
Yes, so the older homes, there's opportunities, and maybe we go back to the cost-sharing portion of the DRRA, where there could be grant programs, and a great example is in Alabama, Strengthen My Alabama Home, where there's grants that are offered to the homeowner, goes right to the homeowner that can retrofit their home, fortify it, make it more resilient, and that takes it right to the homeowner. And if more homeowners embrace that and it's easy for them to do and affordable, it starts to change the face of the community to be more resilient from the existing housing stock.
Yes, please. Thank you. So as far as the building code development process, it's developed, as he indicated, every 3 years, and the federal agencies are heavily involved in the process along with the materially interested parties. So HUD is there, FEMA is there, DOE is there. So there's a variety of representation of the federal agencies as well as National Association of Home Builders and probably the majority of the people that are on this panel. So there is a process for the code updating, and if there are specific issues, that's the opportunity to vet your concern with a proposal, and like I said, federal agencies are heavily involved in that. In addition, so one of my concerns on the mitigation saves reference that he just made, there's a lot of misuse of some of those numbers, and I'm just asking people to be a little bit careful. So the 11-to-1 goes back to no building code, or I'll call them ancient building codes that are 20, 30, 40 years old, or no building codes. So and then that leads into retrofitting existing buildings. NHB has taken on what we're putting together a bunch of tech notes, basically saying here's some low-cost, affordable ways to improve the resiliency of a property. And we have about 25 that are in the hopper right now that we're working on. We're also working with FEMA. We're working with ICC and IBHS. So we have a variety of organizations we're working with, and we want to kind of brand these and put them out there. And if there could be some funding that would go along with that to try to retrofit existing buildings, we think that would be a great opportunity. And it would mesh well with these low-cost solutions to try to improve resiliency of existing homes, which, in our opinion, really is the issue. The codes, what we're calling the modern codes, maybe the last 3-4 cycles, we're calling them resilient. I believe some of the panelists here might disagree with me, but I believe that they're resilient. The home builders believe they're resilient. And we're really at the mature stage of making tweaks now to the code rather than major changes like happened post-Andrew, that happened post-Northridge. So and the urgency, and this goes back to my 2 code cycles. Why 2 code cycles must be in there as opposed to the latest published codes, because we really are in that incremental level of improvements. Not to say that there can't be any, but we're really at the incremental level rather than the major level.
Thank you. Back to your point, Mr. Paulson, about the private sector. We should figure out some way, too, to take advantage of some of their resources that we may not have, like the power companies' unmanned vehicles to survey power lines that are down. So we don't have a lot of drones getting in the way, but some kind of policy to make use of some of that technology.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was in California last week and working with CAL FIRE, Cal OES, and PG&E, and some of the issues they have with the power lines, so being able to clear that brush around it. Florida Power and Light does a really great job of taking care of the power lines in Florida, and Duke Power does a great job, but some of them don't do as good a job. And you're right, there needs to be a way to deal with that, because, when those power lines go down, one, people are out of power, and two, we saw what happened in California, started massive fires that we have to deal with. So it's definitely an issue. I'd like to go back to Mr. Strickland, if you don't mind, the comment he made earlier about having one, I call it a belly button, one place for people, for the state emergency manager, for the governor to go to for all of that. I testified in front of this committee last year when we were putting this stuff together, and that was one of the comments I made. FEMA does a cost-benefit analysis when they put out money after a disaster, what you're going to rebuild, and maybe it's not what not worth rebuilding. And but some of the other agencies don't do that. My part of my testimony is that perhaps all of those types of grants should go through one agency. To me, FEMA was the right place for it to go. And so I'm just supporting what he said. A governor should not have to go, a state emergency manager should not have to go to 10 different agencies to find out what's available for them to rebuild their city or state. And it should be one place to go to get all, one-stop shop kind of thing. So I wanted to support what he was saying. Yeah, that was a good comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the ranking member as well. First of all, I want to thank both of you for the bipartisan legislation we did last year, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. I think it did address a lot of the lessons learned from recent disasters and just continuing to build upon successes that we've had in learning from different disasters. Two, I'm continue to be disappointed, Madam Chair, that our federal agencies aren't participating in these meetings. As you recall, we had HUD that refused to come to a public setting, and now FEMA's not here. We can sit here and talk all day long, and without actually having the agency folks doing their job, it makes it really hard for this to be anything other than theatrics, and that's really disappointing. And I want to say it again, HUD and FEMA, they should be here. They should be intimately involved in this, and they should be facing us as we represent the disaster victims. The comments, Mr. Paulson, thank you for your service and for your comments. I think you're exactly right. Represent South Louisiana and going through numerous disasters. I've seen repeatedly where the lack of coordination among different agencies has wasted extraordinary dollars and just repeatedly victimized, re-victimized disaster victims. And that's not. If we're spending excess dollars, if we're taking more time, if we're subjecting people to more bureaucracy, if we're delaying or impeding recovery, I mean, what are we advancing? What public goal, public policy are we advancing? This just doesn't make sense. And I'll tell you, I'm really frustrated. Just recently, this House passed 3702, which codified the long-term CDBG DR program, and it memorializes this splitting up. And so think about if you're a disaster victim, You may have to go to apply to the National Flood Insurance Program. You may have to go apply to FEMA for a separate grant. You may have to go to SBA. You may have to go to USDA to get food assistance. You may have to go to your state to apply for a STEP-type program assistance for temporary housing. You may have to go to then a state program to do a CDBG-DR program. I mean, why in the world? And look, we've been through these people. They've said, look, I've filled out 7 applications. I mean, this is America, and it's almost 2020, and we can't do better than this, really? And let me say it again. All of these different steps and the proctology exams by the Inspector General and other things, it's not saving money. It's not saving time. We've got to recognize these are disasters, and they're inherently unpredictable. And yes, you know what? We may buy too much ice or water. And you know what? I'll take it all day long, because that's what you have to do, because they're inherently unpredictable. We seem to have lost focus on the fact that these programs are designed to address disaster victims. And looking at these things through the eyes of the disaster victims that I know Congressman Meadows and I hear from every single day. I did a Facebook Live last week, one of our efforts to engage constituents. Just last week, our disaster, our big flood disaster, was in August of 2016. I'm going to take a guess that 70% of the questions are still about people recovering from the disaster. It's more than 3 years later. This isn't okay. It's not. And look, I'm not asking for us to go and pay people 200% or waste money. All we're doing is we're trying to get the money that's already appropriated to the disaster victims. And this whole process is just really incredibly flawed. I'm really excited about what we did with pre-disaster mitigation in regard to the BRIC program. I'm excited about the funds that we expended last year or dedicated last year to resilience projects. I think that's going to pay off over and over again. And I think that having FEMA define this definition of resilience and giving them more flexibility, I think it's going to really go a long way to helping to improve the resiliency of our communities and bringing down this cost of $1.8 trillion we spent on 250 plus disasters since 1980. We can't afford to keep doing this. And building codes and others are a really important part of that. I think that we've got to do a better job, just based on our experience, in utilizing the experience or the willingness of volunteers. When I look back at our disasters, some of the most amazing performance isn't the government. It's actually just the people, the volunteers, and figuring out how we do a better job facilitating that. And if that means we need to give them resources, then let's do that, because it's so much more cost efficient. These people know the communities, and we saw just extraordinary progress that was free because of the work of volunteers, churches, and other service organizations. In talking to the previous administrator, he said, and I don't remember the number, but it was like, Madam Chair, I think 90% of the disasters that we've had were under, and you may know this figure, they were under like $10 million or something. I mean, just some really strong, small figure. But what they do is they do this full FEMA deployment every time. We ought to be looking at whether we just cut a check to the states and just say, hey, look, here's $8 million. We're out. We're not deploying anyone. You do what you need to do. And if you waste the money, it's on you. But just stop all of this expense and time and delay and bureaucracy and help to get things moving a lot faster. Lastly, one of the things, and I have not spoken to you about this, but one of the things, and yes, this is a big, bold, maybe even crazy idea, but when you look at the fact that the Corps of Engineers is supposed to be our offense agency, they're the ones going out there building flood protection projects to complement pre-disaster mitigation and hazard mitigation and others, yet they have a $100 billion backlog. We give them $1 to $2 billion a year in construction funds. We're never going to deliver these projects. It's too slow. It's too expensive. We're never going to deliver these projects under this mechanism. And you look at the fact that they're in Department of Defense. Does that department give them value added? And I think we asked the same question about FEMA. FEMA's in DHS. The number of times I've had administrators privately express frustrations to me about the bureaucracy of DHS. Is that the right place for it? And is value added by being within the department? Or my perhaps crazy or maybe not crazy idea, do we establish a new independent agency and put FEMA and the Corps of Engineers together? Let them, your mission is resilience and recovery, and just let them go to create a SBA type thing and just really be thoughtful about whether there's value added for where they are. So I'd love to hear anybody's response if there's time.
I'd like to comment on your statement on volunteers, and I'm going to link back to FEMA not funding the college-based veterinary medical emergency teams. And actually, what we've done with the Texas model through our College of Vet Medicine-based team is we've built a mechanism where through both our students, our senior vet students, but then also private practitioners, private veterinary technicians, they make up over half of our team. And, you know, one thing about the volunteers, in our perspective, what we do is we give them the platform. And so getting the volunteers in there are great, but they've got to have the tools of the trade to work with. They've got to have the system to work under. And so that's another hole where kind of FEMA not funding this possibility, I think, is creating a hole.
Thank you.
I was just going to mention, I think it's an important point, the piece about ensuring that at the end of the day, we understand that everything we're doing is to meet the needs of victims or survivors from disaster, and hopefully preventing people from being impacted from disaster. And the point about making sure that FEMA is able to address all hazards, that's a priority as well. In addition to what other people have said about the question regarding the building codes, I think the building codes and their enforcement has to be part of a resilient community, and part of allowing that to occur at the local level is ensuring that we have advocates and champions at the local level that are able to infuse these mitigation concepts into the community, and that we're able to move forward and build that. And I don't know that we have that capacity right now to the level that we should at the local level, and I think it's worth investing that as part of implementation of DRRA, making sure that we're building up locals' capacity to be able to influence mitigation actions.
And from the county perspective on that, I would just echo Director Robinson that we need to build up that local level. So emergency management performance grants are so important to building that foundation at the local level. For cities, counties, you know, that's how you build your training and exercises. That's how you can pay for your planning processes, which to me, coming from being a former emergency management consultant, I think the process sometimes is more important than the actual plan itself. But you know, you really get the opportunity to share and understand the expectations with roles and responsibilities for all of your various local government agencies, but also your private sector, as well as informing your volunteer organizations. When I was in college, I was actually the lead for our community emergency response team, and we responded to an F4 tornado and set up ICS in the actual county. And that was something that little town had never experienced before. But you had people there that were trained. We were actually emergency management students that came in and really knew how disasters worked. And I think if you can expand your community and individual preparedness, that will go a long way to kind of building up that resourcefulness at the community level. In regards to the spending and the complexity at FEMA, I completely agree. I'd like to see the numbers on how much money is spent on actual disaster recovery projects versus how much money is spent on the bureaucratic side and the administrative side of disaster recovery as a whole, especially when you start taking a look at these longer-term disaster recovery efforts that take up to 20 years sometimes. So kind of seeing where that can be cut down. Also, I think it's very important to take a look at separating FEMA out of DHS. You need that direct line to the president. Again, you need to be able to mobilize those resources and expedite those operations. So that would be some starting points.
I don't think we do a good enough job incorporating universities, whether it's the veterinarian school or the emergency management school or whatever it might be, and we should work on that. But Mr. Paulson, you're probably the best qualified to speak to whether you want to have a separate agency or not. It's a crazy idea, but in Las Vegas, you can have a crazy idea in the morning and have 2 or 3 people go along with you by afternoon.
And make $1 million to boot, right?
Let's do a round of shots.
Would you repeat that, please?
Should it be a separate agency?
Sorry?
Should FEMA be a separate agency out from underneath DHS?
You know, I've kind of mulled this over my brain, and that especially when we were putting Homeland Security together, and there was arguments on both sides. Your idea of putting FEMA, the Corps of Engineers, and maybe Small Business Administration together would that would make, to me, a lot of sense. However, there are a lot of resources inside Homeland Security that FEMA can draw from. And let me give you one example. When we had, I think it was Hurricane Gustav or one of them, we were going to set up, I think, or the one that went into Texas, excuse me. Hurricane Ike, okay. So there was a lack of communication between the mayor of Houston and the governor. And so we were trying to set up our pods, points of distribution. And at the last minute, the mayor said, we're not going to do that. You know, so we had to do it ourselves. And we had moved a lot of TSA people into Houston, so we didn't have what happened in Katrina, where the whole aviation system was shut down. And but there were 300 TSA agents in Texas, and all I had to do was make a phone call to Kip Hawley, who was the head of TSA at the time, and he gave me 300 agents to staff all these points of distribution. So there was a resource there that I was able to grab. So there's an argument on both sides, really. I can see an independent agency, like you just pointed out, Mr. Graves, but there are also some arguments that inside of Homeland Security, there's a lot of resources there that FEMA can use that it may not have organically.
Madam Chairman, just very quickly, I've spoken to 4 former FEMA directors, James Lee Witt forward, and all 4 of them have said that they agree with this concept. I've got some work to do on Mr. Paulson, apparently, but this concept of, and you can still reach back into DHS, and just like you need to reach back into other agencies, DOD and others, but I think that looking at the value added of being in the bureaucracy versus the flexibility and agility of being independent, I think it outweighs. I think the latter outweighs.
So, Madam Chairman, I'm going to follow up on that particular recommendation. Here's my take on it. Just like when you created DHS, you had one person in charge of making sure that our homeland is secure. Just like we were talking about disaster recovery, if you have one person in charge, it includes HUD, all the others that both the chairman and Mr. Graves are talking about. It allows it to happen. So let me ask Ms. Holman, Mr. Strickland, if the 2 of you would come with 4 ideas that you believe that we can streamline it from a county perspective and from a National Emergency Managers Association that would streamline it. I understand we've got a couple of people from FEMA here. Is that correct? You're from Congressional Affairs? All right, so let me be very, very clear. The next time that they send a congressional liaison to not participate in a briefing, and you take this message back from me, the next time they send the 2 of you here to not participate in a round table, just because we have a Democratic chair, they're going to hear from me. And I want to call before the close of business tomorrow to help me understand why they're having such a hard time meeting with you guys, all right? And I'm here to tell you, we're going to get to the bottom of it. Either you're going to have a meeting with these folks or find another job. And I know it is not your fault, but you need to take that message as succinctly and as aggressively as it's meant. Do you understand? Thank you.
I'd like to hear from you too, because I know that there's been a recent study where almost 1 million people in Texas live in coastal areas without building codes. So you might want to have some comment about that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chair Titus. Of course, I'm in Houston, where we have some of the strictest building codes in Texas. But of course, we are subject to all kinds of different disasters. And I think you might have been talking about Rita, which was right after Katrina, because I was looking back at the years and the evacuation question. But we've had Rita, we've had Ike, we've had Harvey, and we've had 3 500-year floods in 3 years in a row, some of which, didn't even register up here because there was so much happening across the country. And so I think, we appreciate that every disaster is different, and we try to learn our lessons from each disaster. But I do think there is a palpable sense of frustration that we are reinventing the wheel each time. And I agree with a lot of what I heard my colleague, Mr. Graves, talking about just this frustration that why is it so hard to go through the process, the recovery process? Why do you have to submit 7 different applications? And one of the things that I'm focused on is how do we make this a more efficient and effective process for the disaster victims, right? It isn't obvious to them. It isn't obvious to anybody. Okay, first you go to FEMA, and then you go to SBA, and then when you have exhausted that, maybe you can qualify under some of these HUD programs. It's just counterintuitive from that perspective, and so I would love to see this conversation moving in a direction that is, how do we make it simplest for people who probably have the fewest resources and the least ability to handle things in that moment in short-term disaster, but also long-term. We too are still recovering from Harvey, but we're recovering from the Tax Day flood and the Memorial Day flood that were in the years before that. And so there really is a lot of concern that we need to figure out how to make this process more efficient for everybody. And so I'm open to suggestions of how do we do that? Do we rethink the agencies? I mean, I think big thinking on these topics is welcome from my constituents, because going through the recovery process has been very, very challenging. So I want to thank all of you for being here today, for your insights, and for your continued work in this area. Obviously, we're having a conversation this morning, but you work on this all the time, and that is critical. It's what we need. And I think, Ms. Holman, you made the comment that sometimes just the preparedness is as important as the plan itself. And I think that's something that we've learned. I also think Mr. Graves made a comment about the volunteers, and certainly we saw that in Harvey, as well as in other disasters, how important the volunteer work is. And we had the Cajun Navy that came over to Houston with their boats. We've had just all kinds of community-based help in the moment, but we also need a long-term recovery process that will make sense. And it does seem, I agree that we really need some robust oversight over what's happening at FEMA and how we're applying the lessons that we have learned. I too am disappointed that FEMA declined to participate in this roundtable discussion. And I'm also disappointed, and Dr. Bissett, you talked about this briefly, about about FEMA not participating in the VET program. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about that. This is a huge issue at home. We saw it. I was just delivering Meals on Wheels the other day, and there are a lot of recipients. They started doing Animeals in Houston that we were delivering because so many people who were getting Meals on Wheels were giving the food to their pets because they wanted to feed them first. And I think we see that in disasters as well, that people don't want to leave their homes unless they can take their pets. And that's a huge challenge. I'm certainly very familiar with Texas A&M. My own vet at home is a Texas A&M vet school graduate, and we're so proud of the work that you do, and specifically the work you did during Harvey. And I think if we could talk briefly about some of the work that you did during Harvey and other suggestions, and whether you think, I know we asked FEMA to consider implementing a national vet provision to ensure federal capability. Do you think the current capability is sufficient? What would you suggest? So can you talk about what you've done and what you would suggest?
So the Texas model, and again, we were fortunate in that the state bought into what we're doing a number of years ago. We're in our 10th year, and it is developing not only that response, but that preparedness capability around the College of Vet Medicine. Like I mentioned, it provides an opportunity to bring together not only faculty, staff, and students, but the private sector into a response resource. And it's desperately needed, because if you look at most local jurisdictions don't have a strong veterinary medical component as far as part of they're not employed by the jurisdiction. You've got small business people, but you have a jurisdiction that very often cannot commit to paying for those veterinary medical services, and so it goes absent. Then you go up to the state level, And in many states, emergency response has, from the veterinary medical perspective, has gone to the agricultural agencies, those that are involved in regulatory medicine. And again, they do a wonderful job with that, but that's a different thing than responding to Hurricane Harvey. And this method that we use in Texas works so well, and Hurricane Harvey is a perfect example. We deployed pre-landfall and then started moving up the coast, and we basically wound up in every community between Corpus Christi, Texas, and the Louisiana border. As we'd move, we'd leave equipment and people behind to solve those issues. And you know, whenever you don't have that capability, it's going to be filled. The self-deployed issue is a real problem, and that they'll come in and they'll take, in many cases, those animals leave. I'd hate to think about how many animals left the state of Texas. And you can have a lot of different perspectives. Well, there's a lot of strays out there, so maybe that's not a big deal. No, it is a big deal, because whenever a family has lost their home, they've lost their business, they need that bit of hope. And very often it's that animal that does that. It's that animal that starts that recovery process. So this system that we've got works very well. When we're not responding, we're planning. So we're going into communities, and again, same problem with the planning process. We have the opportunity, basically our system, we take students around the state and go into jurisdictions, and we assist them with animal-focused emergency planning. We have the opportunity to work with a number of really tremendous emergency managers. They're overworked. You know, they've got all these major issues they're thinking of, and very often they don't have the time nor the expertise to really address the animal issue. And so this system, like we've built at Texas A&M, works so well because you're building that local capability. And the reality is, and we were in Hurricane Harvey, as we were deploying, there was a tremendous difference in communities that we had helped planned and those that we had not been to that community yet. And we had to basically start over from scratch. So it's really important to provide that structure, and we can do that. My thoughts on the current federal veterinary medical capabilities, and I'm going to go back to Hurricane Harvey, and I was actually sitting just south of Harris County in Fort Bend County, and decision was made to request National Veterinary Emergency Response Team. We requested large animal capabilities and small animal capabilities. About 3 or 4 days later, after that request went in, I got a call late one night, and I said, well, we don't have large animal capabilities. Okay, so scratch that. So I said, okay, so tell me about your small animal side. And basically what they had was 3 people in a rental car. And my comment to them was, that does me no good. I've got people. You've got to have, again, I understand when we're talking about destroyed houses and all of the different pieces of disaster, I understand where the animal piece fits. But you've got to have a robust capability that can go into a community, help them prepare, and then provide a robust veterinary medical response if you're going to truly take care of that community. And I just think that's critically important. And so I think the current model is deficient. I think FEMA has the opportunity to address that.
Thank you. I think that's helpful.
Fletcher, we're going to be working on some amendments in the new year, and I hope all of you will help us with the things that we've talked about today. But the implementation of 1218 is certainly going to be one of them. And also, we want to look at the provision that set up local pet shelters, because we put a lot of money out there, but we don't really have any accountability of who's doing it, what they're doing, how they're doing.
Yeah, so I can comment on that and as well. The kind of the information management, you know, I've asked this question. I'm actually speaking at a conference tomorrow, and I'm going to ask the question, how many animals did we shelter in the last 3 federally declared disasters? We don't have a clue.
That's right.
And so we have to have better information management systems. I know we got to experience problems with that whenever we deployed to California after the Camp wildfires. where you had that system for managing that information was completely overwhelmed. We had to shut down animal transfers for 7 days so that we could build a system so that we made sure we didn't send somebody's pet away to be adopted out.
Yeah,
So it's important.
it is. Thank you. John?
Thank you very much. I was thinking about this issue, and there are overwhelming emergencies, Camp Fire, the hurricanes, and so forth. On the smaller ones, California has a pretty good system set up, and a lot of volunteers all ready to go. Not perfect, but can be overwhelmed. I do want to go to a couple of things. The Camp Fire is one example of 4 fires in California that have been declared emergencies or national emergencies. In every one of those cases, save one, 3 of the 4, the fires occurred in rural areas in which the counties were unable and continue today to be unable to front the money for the local infrastructure, county infrastructure, city infrastructure, and the like. Eventually, they get repaid by FEMA, but eventually is a few years in some cases. So my question really for Ms. Holman is, I'd like to have your opinion on an effort that I believe we should make here to allow FEMA to put the money up front to assist these counties who do not have the capability of borrowing or raising the several tens of millions that might be necessary to rebuild the local infrastructure. Should we have that in the next legislation?
I think that would go a long way to helping, especially your more rural areas, recover. Because when you think about it, your community is impacted, your residents are impacted, your residents are displaced, and then you need people to come back, but to raise the tax revenue to pay for it. But in order for them to come back, you need to rebuild your roads, you need to rebuild your schools, you need to establish jobs and do some economic recovery, but you can't do any of that until the people come back. So it's a lot of chicken before the egg. That would go a long way into helping, provide those initial financial resources for counties. But the other piece of that, I think, is also making sure that counties are prepared to manage it, because they're also going to be having staffing issues and also just particularly expertise and time. So having those pre-disaster recovery plans and providing funding for local communities to build and develop those very robust plans not only creates kind of a framework for them to manage that and to get kind of a kick start, but also helps them understand the roles and responsibilities of the entities in the private sector in their own communities and what those impacts would be. So I think, maybe being able to demonstrate that there's been some forethought with that and being able to provide that money and expedite the access to that, or at least a significant portion of it to get kickstarted, would go a long way.
There seem to be 2 different things here, and one is the pre-disaster planning, and I'm sure that varies from excellent to not so good, and that we can continue to work on that, and the state organizations are responsible for pushing that down to the city or county, and that's the way, and that's a good thing. My concern is that when a disaster has happened, and let's say the Camp Fire, the infrastructure improvements, that is the public infrastructure, sanitation, roads, all of it, water systems, it's a huge bill. Now, under the present situation, FEMA will reimburse a large share of that cost, not 100% in most cases, but a large share of it. But the local government has to front the money and then come in later. It seems to me that we could use something very similar to what is very common across the United States. If you're going to build a home, you get a construction loan. And when your plans are in, you get 10%. You know what the general cost is going to be. It's going to be 100. And so 10% when you get your plans in, another 10% when you begin construction, and so forth, coming up to, say, 80% of the total anticipated cost. Why not? The only question for the federal government is that money's going to leave our pocket sooner, transferred to the local government, which would ultimately have that money anyway. So I'm just trying to find a way to, in our legislation, develop a program so that the money is made available to these, I'll just say, local entities, large or small, upfront in a coordinated way. You've got estimated cost, okay, you get 10%. You got your construction plans, you get another 15, 20%. You're underway, so the money begins to flow over a period of time. Thank you for your support of my idea.
Thank you.
Finally, there is in this thing escape. How do you get out of town? How do you get out of Houston or whatever? We have a piece of legislation, it's called the Escape Act. Yes, and I don't remember what E stands for, let alone what the P is. But the Escape Act is designed to develop some money up front in the sort of along the hazard mitigation. Well, one of the hazards is how do you get out of here? I'm working with our friends from Massachusetts, something about Cape Cod. There's one road out. There was two roads out of the camp area, Paradise, and so forth all across the area. So the escape routes. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to get here, even though simultaneously there is another hearing going on, because I want to look at this writ large, not ask simply about FEMA. And the reason I look at it this way is that when I see FEMA, today I see climate change. And my district, the nation's capital, is located on two rivers, the Anacostia and the Potomac. We have seen, this is the nation's capital, the capital that the world looks to. We have seen, and I guess this could go to Mr. Strickland, there could be others of you who have words here. We have seen floods that went all the way to Constitution Avenue, the archives. I'll go to Mr. Strickland. Maryland, of course, is deeply implicated, but you could see whole sections of this nation's capital underwater because of climate change, and I need to know whether or not, what are the biggest challenges in the National Capital Region in disaster preparation to keep this fast-coming emergency from overtaking us first here, so that the whole world can see that you can't even keep your own capital above water. Start with Mr. Strickland, if you have any
I appreciate that.
words of wisdom for us here.
I do sit as part of the Homeland Security Executive Committee for the National Capital Region, and we're really, we do focus on an overall preparedness for the region from an all hazards perspective. So we're not exclusively terrorist related, but we are all hazard. And with that, Virginia, DC, and Maryland have looked at mitigation projects that we could do together from a regional perspective. Again, that comes back to putting together a really good application that shows a good cost-benefit ratio and return on investment that we can submit to FEMA. With this pre-disaster mitigation becoming BRIC, we're going to have more money that we'll be able to compete for. And one of the items we do want to shoot for is working with the district as well as Northern Virginia on some of those areas.
I mean, do you see them all flooding again, for
Yes,
example?
and we see areas in Maryland and Virginia that are flooding the exact same way.
Are we prepared to keep them all from flooding and the archives from flooding again? I mean, are we, what should we be doing to make sure that we're not overtaken by another flood catastrophe right here in the center of the federal enclave?
Well, that's, again, as we move forward with this opportunity with BRIC, is that we'll end up having money available with technical assistance to come in and help us make assessments and be able to put together good projects that'll compete for the money that's available. One of the things that the National Emergency Managers Association has suggested to FEMA with this policy as BRIC comes out is that there be a base amount given to each state and the district and the territories so that we can address, without going through a competitive national basis, some of these issues that truly are local. Again, that was in our recommendations to FEMA. We're waiting to see how that kind of shakes out in the policy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank all of you very much for being here. It's been quite informative. I think you can tell from the comments by the members, including the ranking member, that we have concerns. We were very proud of this bill. We worked, all of you, very hard on getting it through, and now we just want to take advantage of the word that I think every one of you used at some point or other, the opportunity that it provides. But we will be looking more closely at this, and we'll look at your recommendations. We may have some amendments in the new year, and I hope you'll all continue to work with us as we move those forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If it gets like a good, that like one of the freshmen can sit.
Check.
Well, I've got the name plates. I thought you were talking about the tents for the witnesses. Yeah, I guess there was something wrong.
What time do we think we want to put folders together?
Whatever works for you.
Check, check.
Absolutely. Yeah.